Before I start, I want to quickly go over just a short definition. What is the difference between funding and finance? Those terms are often used interchangeably. They're actually quite different things. So funding's about who pays for the infrastructure. That could be the taxpayers, the ratepayers, or anyone who pays a fee to use a particular service. And then financing is about the methods used to cover the upfront costs for the investment. So let's say you're wanting to buy a washing machine, your salary or your income is going to pay for that washing machine. That's going to be the funding, but you may also want to borrow some money to get it quicker. So that's the financing. Very simple, but quite different, and important to bear those differences in mind when you start to talk about how different things can be funded and financed. So what is the problem that we are trying to address? So New Zealand has been, you would have read about this in the news, I'm sure, but New Zealand has been dramatically underinvesting in essential infrastructure for several decades now. As a country, we sort of invest and underinvest in waves. And we've been underinvesting in a big wave for about the last 30 years, and it's coming to a head. So a lot of our infrastructure is aging out at the same time. We've sweated a lot of it to the very nth degree, to the breaking point, and now we kind of have to get on and replace some things. So our biggest shortfalls are in things like transport, water infrastructure, energy, and housing. If we continue to invest at current rates, essentially some experts predict a shortfall of around $210 billion over the next 30 years. So we should be spending around about double what we are spending each year, essentially. And then, of course, we've got a lot of pressures coming up. We've got population growing in the next 10 to 15 years or so. We're probably going to hit 6 million from a current 5 million population. And a lot of that population growth is going to be happening in a few key cities. And then we've also got climate change to contend with. So all of those things are putting added strain on our infrastructure as well. You often might hear that we spend roughly equivalent to other countries on infrastructure, but when I looked into it in more detail, I found that actually the problem is not that we're not efficient. The problem is that we're actually spending per capita quite a bit less than other countries in the OECD. If you look at it as a proportion of GDP, we're about average, but if you look at it as a proportion of per capita, we're in the lowest half of countries and what they spend. And the report really argues that we should be spending actually a lot more than other countries per capita. And that's for a few different reasons. One is that we have this big shortfall to catch up on. Another is that we have really unique challenges as a country. We're long, thin, very sparsely populated in some places. We have a lot of seismic issues. We have a lot of exposure to natural hazards as well, and to coastal erosion and slips and things like that. So for all of those reasons, we argue we should actually be spending quite a bit more at the moment overall. There's also the question, should we be improving our efficiency? And I found there was a lack of really good quality international benchmarking data about how efficiently we spend overall compared to other countries. But what there is suggests we perform reasonably well on most types of infrastructure. Perhaps a little bit less well on some of those more complex things like tunnelling, which we don't do very often. But I think given our geographical challenges in New Zealand, I think we do pretty well in terms of efficiency. However, that is not to say we shouldn't be upping our game. All countries, I think, can really improve, especially in reducing cost and time overruns and things like that. And there's quite a lot we could be doing there to try and get more for our buck, I guess. One of the really big things that came out of the research was this issue of boom and bust. One of the key reasons I think we're in this underinvestment sort of situation is politically driven. So changing priorities from different successive governments causes waste and foregone opportunities for economic growth, because they'll often pull out of a project for, I guess, political reasons. And I'm not casting blame on any particular government here. This happens every time there's a change of government, and has done historically. So the sort of flip-flopping costs us a lot of money, because not only have we sunk lots of consultancy fees and things into projects, but also we've, the longer it takes to build infrastructure, the more it costs, and the more, you've lost a lot of economic benefits from not having that infrastructure available to use. And one really good example of that is probably the Auckland Harbour Bridge. when it opened in 1959, it was already under capacity. It had originally supposed to be 7 lanes of driving and 2 lanes of walking and cycling, but it was reduced at the last minute to save money. And ever since then, we've been trying to come up with a solution to that and flip-flopping back and forth from different proposals. And then 60 years later, we are unfortunately still sitting there with no solution. So that's a great example of how we're sort of missing out on opportunities because we are not able to agree a long-term vision on how we do our infrastructure provision. And so one of the main recommendations from the report is that we should be really locking down a long-term pipeline for infrastructure investment, and that we need to get multi-party buy-in for that as much as possible. We could save, according to some estimates, billions of dollars each year. I don't know if that's right or not, but it seems a lot. But we can certainly save a huge amount from doing that. So because we don't have enough money stashed away to pay for everything we need right now, the bulk of new investment will almost certainly have to be financed by debt. And there are several advantages to financing infrastructure by debt. Borrowing allows the cost of the project to be spread out over time, and it also allows more to be built now and more quickly. And it also is generally seen as quite equitable because you're spreading the cost of the infrastructure over time. So all the people who use it over the next 20, 30 years are paying for it gradually over its lifetime. You may have heard there's not very much headroom to borrow more, but I don't think that's right looking at the evidence. So compared to other countries, we actually have quite a low debt. And it's pretty clear we could be borrowing quite a bit more without it affecting our credit rating also. So according to Standard & Poor's, New Zealand could borrow as much as $120 billion before risking any credit rating downgrade. I'm not recommending we borrow 120 billion, by the way. That's just to say that, you know, we do have a bit of headroom and wiggle room in there to be borrowing more to pay for those kind of infrastructure projects that are going to bring economic growth to New Zealand. And similarly at local government level, and Simon can talk more about this later, but at local government level, some councils could certainly be looking to be borrowing more than they are also, although there are obvious constraints there in terms of them having the revenue to be able to pay back their debts. So there are different types of borrowing. I'll just very quickly explain these, and hopefully we can get into more about this in the discussion as well. But central and local government can borrow from banks and other investors based on their reputation as a safe bet for paying that money back. And so they do that by issuing bonds, for example, and then they can spend that money on whatever projects they want to. And that's often referred to as public debt because the government or councils are the ones raising the finance and using their revenue to pay for it. They can also borrow for a specific project. So private investment, for example, can take many forms, but let's say the government decides to set up a public-private partnership to build 10 new schools. In that case, they might contract with a private partner or a group of partners to design and build and maintain the schools over the long term, and also to sort out the financing for that project. So in that case, the private partner would bring the finance to the partnership, and then the government would pay that back over time. For local government, there's also a couple of other options. So most council debt, I think around 90%, is financed through the Local Government Funding Agency, LGFA. That was established in 2011 to deliver efficient financing for local government by pooling councils' borrowing power. So LGFA borrows cheaply from domestic and international lenders and then lends that money to member councils. It's slightly more expensive in terms of interest than central government borrowing, but not much. And then a council, I won't go into detail on this here, but a council can also borrow for a specific project under a fairly new piece of legislation, the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act 2020. This method of borrowing has only been used a couple of times so far, once in Wellington, once in Tauranga. And the advantage of it is that councils can borrow for specific projects off their balance sheets, which means they can then borrow more than they'd otherwise be able to borrow under current LGFA borrowing limits. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time because I tend to go on about topics I'm passionate about. Fairness principles. So just before we talk about the funding side of things, the report goes into a lot of detail about the different fairness principles by which we should establish who pays for what. And I think it's really the crux of the matter. So the public discourse about who should pay is sometimes focused on this benefit principle, which is the principle that the person who uses the infrastructure should pay for it. Makes logical sense, but there are actually several principles, and often they conflict with one another. The exacerbator principle, that is linked to the benefit principle, but it's the opposite. So it's the principle that whoever causes a need for the use of costly resources, maybe someone who pollutes a river or causes congestion, that they should pay for it. Horizontal equity is a tax principle that citizens with the same characteristics should pay the same tax. So, for example, a person who uses the same amount of water as another person should pay the same amount. Vertical equity is about the idea that citizens with greater ability to pay should pay more tax than those with less ability to pay, which is known as a progressive tax. And that might be based on your income, your consumption, your wealth, or your property value. But basically, the idea is that the more you have, the more you would pay. Intergenerational equity is about, well, it's on what it says on the tin, is about the idea that we should be seeking fairness across generations. So we shouldn't have one generation paying the bulk of something and then another generation gets to enjoy that without paying anything for it. And tax incidence is not really a fairness principle. It's more about just being aware that sometimes you might put a tax on something, but it's actually someone else who pays for it. For example, rates are a tax on property owners, but the cost of rates is also passed on to renters. So just being aware of who ends up actually paying for things. Yeah, so all of those principles involve value judgments. They also often conflict with one another, as I said. And so the report essentially argues it's really important to take into account all of these different principles when making decisions on infrastructure, funding and financing. So funding, this is the actual tough bit. I think it's harder to get funding for things than it is finance, it seems to me. So it's about who pays for the infrastructure. Is it you or is it me? So I think things get a bit messy when the public narrative starts to conflate funding and financing. For example, the government might get someone to finance a big new project, but that isn't the same as them paying for the project. So the key message from me is that there's no magic bullet to fund infrastructure. It's all just us guys paying, but in different ways. So no magical fairy is going to come down and pay for any of this, this deficit that we've built up for ourselves. So the question then becomes, I think, what is the fairest, most efficient, most effective way to pay for things? And the answer, I think, will be a bit different for different types of infrastructure. Taxation has the advantage of being quite straightforward and efficient to collect, which makes it quite a cheap way to fund things. It also has good levers to address questions of equity because it's progressive, or income tax is progressive and based on the ability to pay. Other types of tax, such as wealth, inheritance, capital gains tax, also have the added advantage of transferring wealth between generations and tapping into that intergenerational equity principle. But of course, raising taxes to pay for infrastructure is not popular. Rates, the advantage of rates is that you pay locally for what you use locally, so it encourages accountability. But the disadvantage is that rates can be a blunt tool. So you pay rates based on property value rather than based on the ability to pay. So you also pay per property rather than by individual. And that means that some people end up paying substantially more than others who use the same amount of infrastructure. And as you will also be aware, there's a limit to how much you can raise rates before it becomes untenable for many people and they start to really struggle financially, which is obviously not desirable from a social point of view. So the people who tend to suffer, when rates go up a lot are those who are on low or fixed incomes. And then user charges, this is where direct users or beneficiaries of infrastructure pay, for example, via road tolls, via water charges. Attaching revenue to infrastructure provision means more infrastructure can be built more quickly because it takes pressure off debt repayments. And then attaching revenue to infrastructure can also lead to its more efficient use. And one great example there would be, for example, Kapiti Coast District Council bought in water meters and started charging for people for their water use, and that very quickly led to the discovery of hundreds of leaks which were able to be fixed, and they reduced the amount of water lost to leakage by 90%, and private use also reduced about 26%. So yeah, putting user charges can lead to some good outcomes in addition to just building revenue. Disadvantages of user charges, of course, is that they can sometimes be expensive to administer and they're sometimes not very efficient. So this type of approach, I think, is best used where it brings other benefits in addition to just revenue. And also to note, it's really important to consider questions of equity, making decisions about user charging approaches, because they essentially distribute the requirement to pay in different ways across populations. So we need to be mindful of where that cost ends up falling. I think in most funding decisions, you're going to find that the fairest, most efficient, most effective way to fund something is going to be via a mix of taxation rates and user charges. But I think the main thing is really that you're having that discussion for each different type of funding decision rather than leaping straight to one model over another one. Right, so just briefly run through our recommendations, and then we're gonna turn to the panel discussion. There's a lot of recommendations in this report. It's quite a long report. I really recommend you have a look if you're interested, but I've just summarized the top 7 recs here, and I'll go through them very quickly. So the first one is obviously, I mentioned before, that we should be developing a long-term vision as a country. We'll be saving a huge amount of money if we did that, reducing a lot of wastage, and that will require a long-term plan that is bought into by all the different parties. I also talked, I touched briefly on the fact that we could be getting more from our infrastructure investment. We've been focusing probably too little on maintenance. It's easy to turn to shiny new projects that win votes than it is to do the boring old maintenance. So I think we could do better at keeping what we've already got in a good state. And then we could also do a lot better at reducing cost and time overruns, and that's worth having a go at. I think we need to be using a range of approaches to funding and financing infrastructure, and we should be looking at all the different potential ways that we can do that. But we do need, as a country, to be recognising that the bulk of our needs will be financed by debt and will be funded by all of us, mostly through taxation and rates, and that we all need to be responsible for, I think, building up a bit of a public mandate for that increased investment that we're going to be needing. No one wants to spend money. Sometimes it's actually necessary. And I think voters also need to be hearing their leaders saying buying stuff costs money, guys. Local councils also clearly need more money. They're really struggling, and we go into some detail on this in the report, and Simon can no doubt tell you more as well, but several large reports and reviews have highlighted that local government needs more revenue, so we need to be looking at ways to do that, whether it's asking central government to pay rates on their property, or whether it's dropping the need to pay GST on rates, so that more money goes into council coffers from rates. There are a lot of ways we could be doing this, but it's pretty clear we need to be doing at least one of them, and preferably several. So user charges option, as I said, are also definitely worth looking into as a supplementary form of funding. They include things like value capture and tolls and user charges, especially where those approaches bring additional benefits. But I do think that those approaches are likely to be supplementary in most cases. They're more likely to be the icing than the cake in terms of funding. We should also be ensuring those fairness principles are used to consider questions on funding and financing as much as possible. And we talked a lot in the report then about PPPs. PPPs cause a bit of division in New Zealand, which is interesting because in some countries they're a lot less contentious politically, and the report really aimed to give an objective look at the research around how they work and come up with a range of recommendations focused on, the recommendations basically were around the idea that if we do them here, we need to get the best out of them. We don't want to be repeating the mistakes that other countries have made. And I think the most important point there is probably the importance of fitting the type of procurement that we use to the project. So, sometimes a PPP will be the best approach and sometimes it won't. So we don't want to go into it just, loving one procurement over another one and not sort of applying it to the specific project. And another key conclusion was really the importance of doing better research in this space, because there's not a lot of really good quality independent research out there on PPPs, despite the fact that they've been around for several decades now, which I thought was surprising. But yeah, well worth looking into the report if you're interested in PPPs. I think we've dedicated 20 or 30 pages to them. And then finally, we looked at city and regional deals, and I think I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but we can discuss that more in the chat if people would like to. So I'm going to end it there and say thank you for listening, and look forward to now having a bit of a chat with the panelists.